I'm Jono Buchanan. In this video, we're going to look at parallel distortion. The idea of being able to add a distortion channel alongside the dry signals that make up a project. And we're going to be basing this around a multi-track drum project. So what I've got here is a series of individual drum parts which make up a multi-track session. And this is what they sound like just by themselves. Now, if those drums sound a little bit crunchy to you, that's because brilliantly within this session, this is a drum drops session, in fact. And within this session, there's one channel, which is called crust, which is down here, which is a distortion channel. This is a microphone channel that's been captured alongside the drums, which I've made quite prominent within the mix, which by itself sounds like this. So we've got this deliberately quite trashy sound, which often makes drums sound powerful and rich and big. Now, what happens if you're working on a track session? Maybe you're using a track within Drummer, for instance, or you're working with drums and you want to introduce this, but you don't actually have microphones anywhere available to add to a drum session that you're recording, or indeed you're working with electronic sounds which have never seen the light of day or aren't going to be recorded through microphones in that way. So in order to explore that, let's turn this channel off and think about creating a parallel distortion treatment of our own, rather than relying on one that's already been recorded. What do the drums sound like without that track? Okay, so a whole lot cleaner is the answer. Now, what we've got a chance to do whenever we think about parallel distortion is to decide whether or not we're going to apply this to the entire collection of drum instruments, or maybe just to one or two individual tracks within it. So for example, I could decide just simply to add distortion to the snare drums, or to the kick drums, or to the toms, but to leave everything else alone. Well, let's see what that sounds like first of all. What I'm going to do is to come to two snare parts which are here, and I'm going to select them both, which means that when I set up a new auxiliary send from these, both of them will have that auxiliary assignment attached to them. And what I'm going to do is to turn up those sends, and you can see that auxiliary 2 has been created here automatically. I'm going to call this parallel distortion. And what I'm then in a position to do, I'm going to just solo these parts actually so we can hear them by themselves without the other drums playing, is that over here what I'm going to do is to go and find a processor which is going to provide me with some distortion. I want that to happen in stereo, so I'm going to make this a stereo auxiliary track, which isn't going to happen by default if the two sounds feeding it are both mono, which they are in this context. So I've made that a stereo effect. And then what I'm going to do is to click here, come into the distortion options, and I'm going to select Clip Distortion, which is this plugin here. Now, when I select that option, I get a chance to see the Clip Distortion plugin and to have a look at the parameters that are available to me. Well, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the mix dial up to 100%. So what that means is that the only sound I'm going to get out of this is going to be the distorted signal. None of the original sound is going to play. And the reason why I'm doing that is because I'm running this in parallel with the original sounds. These two sounds here and their faders are providing me with dry signal, and I just want the auxiliary to provide me with wet signal, so the mix can be at 100%. So what I can do within this, first of all, is I can decide the input gain. If I need to, I can boost the incoming volume. And then what I can do is to add the amount of distortion drive that I want to add here as well, which I can do here. And you can see that I get a slightly more extreme, squared out, distorted figure in this waveform display the more I push the drive control. What I can then do is to center the tone of the distortion that I want around a frequency here. And similarly, what I'm able to do is to filter it at the top end as well. So effectively what I'm doing is to narrow the area around which I'm concentrating the distorted sort of nature of the sound that I'm going to produce. I've also got a low pass filter, which is going to allow me to decide whether or not I want to roll out the top of the sort of frequencies that are produced as a result of distortion. And I've also got a high shelf to do the same thing at the other end of the mix. And I've then got an output gain control to sort of bias the sound in a particular way. So having had a look at the overall parameters, let's actually just have a listen to the way that this plugin works, and start making some changes to the sound that feel like they're in keeping with what the snare drum could potentially provide us with. Okay, so what I've done here is to make this quite high, quite slappy distortion. Let's hear how this sounds in the context of the track overall. I've deliberately made it up here. I think we'll find it easy to hear this sound now in the context of the entire session. And what I've got a chance to do, of course, is to use the return level of this auxiliary as the volume of the distortion. Because the original sound is happening anyway, it's happening on its own faders, what I'm in a position to do is to decide how much of this sound I want to introduce simply by modulating or changing the volume of this fader. So what that's doing is it's providing the snare with more color. We can make that more extreme. Let's do that now. Let's push the drive a little harder. Let's turn up the gain and turn up the output gain a little as well. So because the snare is kind of the middle of the drum mix, it's obviously above the kicks and it's below the hats, what we get is this much more inflated sense of the mid-range now within this the parallel distortion treatments that we've set up. And that's providing a particular type of color. And actually it's not totally dissimilar to the sound of that crossed mic, which we've muted. It's providing us with a very mid-rangey, slightly overblown sound. So what we've seen here is how we can apply parallel distortion just to individual elements of the mix. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep the parallel distortion in place, but I'm going to turn off these two sends from the snare. And instead, what I'm going to do is to come up to the main drum track here. You can see that what I've done is to create a track stack for these drums. So all of the individual channels are being routed through to bus number 1, which is here, and therefore anything I put on this channel or anything I send from this channel is going to affect all of the sounds within it. So if I make the overall drum mix send to my parallel distortion, what I have a chance to do now is to turn up the amount from this this entire massed stack of drums, and it's going to be feeding into the parallel distortion treatment that I've created. Now this is likely to be pretty overwhelming because now rather than simply being fed from the snares, it's being fed from every single sound within the mix. So what I'm going to do is I'll leave all the settings exactly as they are, but I am going to just turn down the return fader and we'll introduce this slowly to make sure that we don't totally overwhelm the entire mix. Okay, so this isn't sounding great. And the reason for that is what we've done in the sort of first instance is to configure a sort of distortion solution which worked quite nicely for making raspy snares, but it's not really doing anything useful for the kicks or for the overheads or for the other sort of bits within the mix which aren't in the sort of frequency area where the snares exist. So what we've got a chance to do is either to reconfigure these settings or to go looking maybe through some of the presets that are available for distortion or the Clip Distortion plugin, just to sort of see some alternative start points to see if we can find something close to something that might be sounding a little bit better, and then maybe to tweak that so that it perfectly fits what we're looking for. So as with all of Logic's effects, if you click up here where it says factory default, what you'll find is that you have a series of presets from which you can choose. And what I'm going to do is to come right down to the bottom and select warm clip distortion. What I want is a almost more sort of saturated sound that's a little bit warmer, a little bit more forgiving, a little bit less sort of snarey, if you like, and maybe something that's just going to provide us with a sort of more rounded tone. Let's have a listen. Okay, so by soloing this bus, what I've had a chance to do is just to hear the distortion by itself. And you can now hear that into that distortion, more of the kit elements are playing. We're hearing those kick drums a little bit and we're hearing them light up. Now let's be clear, what distortion does is it provides overtones. It provides more harmonics. So what we're doing when we're adding distortion is we're increasing the sort of harmonic footprint of the sound. And bearing in mind we're working on this on a drum collection of tracks, we already have loads of frequency content. So what we get is kind of really pleasingly overblown effect. It's almost like the distortion is making us feel like the drums are sort of almost too big for the frame, which is kind of nice. It almost feels powerful or almost a little bit dangerous in some contexts. Again, let's just introduce it and put it in at a volume that feels like it might be suiting these drums rather than overpowering them. Okay, so what we've got here is a sort of more saturated sound. It's a little bit more biting, it's a little bit more overblown, and of course it's a bit more ours as well. We've shaped this and made it something we want it to be. So in this video, we've seen the power of parallel distortion. What we have a chance to do here is to basically add a little bit of our own production value to a set of multi-track recordings like these drums. And we can see that the auxiliary return fader allows us to decide how much of that sound we're going to bring to the mix. But it's not just drums that can benefit from parallel distortion. You can add this to synth leads, to bass lines, to anything you like. And because, of course, you could then automate those returns, you could actually have the distortion element of your track be dynamic in your piece. If you decided that your synth lead was going to be kind of dry and clean during the verses, but become a little bit raspier during the choruses, then of course you can set up parallel distortion and use automation to push the volume of that auxiliary bus a little bit more when you get to the more dynamic parts of your track and you want them to have a slightly bigger sonic footprint. So parallel distortion is amazing. It gives us this extra weight, this extra power, and a little bit more danger in our mixes too.